everyone, Courtney here, your plaid-clad librarian, back with the next video in our storytelling series, and this one is all about setting the scene. There are a lot of different ways where you can present your story depending on where it takes place in the world, in time, in the universe, wherever. So let's start off with a little activity. Something just for fun, and just to kind of give an example and see how things go. So I want you to imagine the setting of this story. Imagine you are walking down the street and someone approaches you and says, "Excuse me, I've lost my dog. Can you tell me if you've seen them?" What do you imagine? What's the location going on here? What's going on in the world where you are? Now, with that in your head, you say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I've not seen your dog. I'll be sure to keep an eye out for it." And they thank you and walk away and wave. And you wave to the kind dragon person that had just asked you about their dog, and you go along on your day. A dragon person. Were you really expecting that? Which, if you were, kudos. I mean, you got a brain as weird as mine. Props. But does that change your setting? Does it change everything? Suddenly the people are dragon people, and that's absolutely perfectly fine. So now let's add, you try to cross the street, but you have to duck in order to avoid the flying cars. Does that change things too? Would all of this have been helpful to know before you actually dove into the story? That's why we have scenes. That's why we have scene setting. World building is what it's called. So this video is going to be all about world building and how do we set a scene so that people, your readers, your viewers, your audience in general can see the world that you have built. So here we go. We're going to start this off by looking at world building as a whole. And then later on we'll go into scene setting a little bit. So first of all, world building is a process that creators go through in order to determine where their story exists in the universe. First of all, you kind of have to build your universe. For starters, is the story you're telling a real story based off of the world that we know and understand? Or is it a made-up story? If you're telling a real story, it's important to share information that your audience may not be aware of. For instance, if the story is set in a different country or a different culture than what your audience is familiar with, it's good to kind of explain those little details so that people will understand the story better. If you're telling an imaginary one, this world exists completely in your head, and it's helpful for your audience to be able to get a good idea of how that world works so that they can understand the story as well. For instance, let's say that there's a story that you want to tell that is just crazy and outlandish, would not fit in our world as it sits, where adventurers are going off on missions, people have superpowers, a whale appears out of nowhere in the sky along with a bowl of petunias and falls to the ground. You never really know. But that sort of thing can really seem odd and out of place if you have a world and a universe where those things don't happen. But if you make a world where those things can happen, then your story is realistic. So long as your story fits to your world, it can work. Kristen Kiefer, the creator of the Well Storied podcast, explained that there are two main methods that people generally use when they are world building. The first one is an inside-out method. This method is when you already have a story in mind. You kind of know what you want to have happen. Maybe you have some characters in your head. You have the story first, and you start with the inside of the story, and then you build the world around it so that the world fits that story. The other method is the outside-in version. This is a version where you build the world first, usually in broad sweeping strokes. Maybe you've developed the geography of the world, the kingdoms as they are, governments, ecosystems, stuff like that. And once you have that going, then you start to build a story within the world you've already developed. I personally tend to use a variety of the both of them, depending on what kind of story I want to tell, and also depending on kind of what inspires me and what I am excited to do. And that's okay, you can flip-flop between the two of them, you can have a preference if that's what you prefer, but these are different ways where you can approach telling a story. When you're creating a world, there are certain things that you should be aware of and be aware of within that world so that your story can fit well into it. Things like government. Is this a democracy, a monarchy with kings and queens? Is this communism or anarchy? It could be any of those things, but it's helpful to know because the way people interact outside of their own homes will depend on how that works. There's also geography. Does the story take place in a mountain, in a desert, in the middle of the ocean, in space? What about religion, culture, education, family dynamics? For instance, if your characters live in a situation and a culture where they're only allowed to have one child and they're the third child of the family, conflict. What about military economy? Now, you don't have to have all of these answers right away, but you should consider having just kind of a general idea if it's relevant to your story. If you're like super into world building and you're like, I want to know everything because that's what I want to know, go do it, do the thing. But if it's not relevant to your story and you don't want to include it for your audience, you're not obligated to do so. Have the things that are relevant to them. For instance, if your entire story has nothing to do with the military, you don't want to think about the military in the way that it's built up in that world, your characters aren't going to get involved with anything in the military. Like, there's no reason to consider the military or include it or whatever, and you don't want to, don't do it. It's fine. World building is, in short, the world as we know it. And when you're presenting your story, some things that you might want to consider is what is the surrounding area? Your town, your country, your planet, if that's important. What's going on in the world? What's going to affect the lives of your characters? That's what you should include in your story. Consider what rules of the world influences your character. For instance, what laws apply to them. If, for instance, it is illegal and punishable by imprisonment to cross the street, is your character going to do that? And that's something to consider, the consequences that happen, because those consequences can create conflict. And speaking of conflict, what dangers are out there? Are there wild animals all over the place that are going to rip and tear? Is the world populated by monsters, or is it populated by fairies who are not cruel and evil? Or maybe they are, no judgment. What risks are there? What rewards are there? What are things that people can do to make money, to establish a business, a trade, to be secure? What type of shelter do people need? How do they get their food? But all of this is important what matters to plot. For instance, if somebody can just get their food from this grocery store, it's not that big of a deal. They just go and do that. You don't have to include that in your story at all. However, if they have to go hunting and gathering and they have to face all these dangers just to put dinner on the table, that might be something worth exploring within your storyline. Also consider things like the physical description of the area. For instance, you had the mountains and the oceans, but what challenges come with that? Is it very cold? Are these things that they have to consider? Are they in a desert where there's not a lot of food? These are things that your characters are probably going to have to deal with. And let's say that they're in a world where it's really socially unacceptable for you to go hunting to get your food. That food is supposed to be provided for you, but nobody's delivered a shipment, so you have to take matters into your own hands. But that's not acceptable within that world, and people will shun you. And how do you get around that? How do your characters get around that? And these are all things that should be considered and thought about. And again, if it's not relevant, don't bother with it, unless you want to. For funsies is always for funsies. I want to talk about scene setting for a little bit, and scene setting is where the character is in the moment that the story is being told. Setting a scene helps an audience better engage with the story because they have a better understanding of the picture of what's going on. So at the beginning of this video, I said imagine that you were walking down a street and somebody approaches you. I'm sure every single one of you imagined a completely different scene of exactly how that looked. But what if I had taken a moment to explain that it was a road made out of conveyor belts where you just stand on it and it shoots you around all over, kind of like those spots in airports? And those buildings were made of a certain type of material, and there were flying cars, which you found out about later, but that would have been helpful to give you an idea of what was going on then. Not only that, the people around you, some were dragons, some were giraffe folk, others were made out of rocks. A very different idea. What if I explained that the dog that guy was looking for had 5 heads? These details of things that are happening within the scene help you imagine the idea of what's happening better. An audience has the opportunity to understand what's going on in the world that the story is within, and that's very helpful. In the scene, you're going to want to focus on what's relevant again, just like with world building. What is relevant for the audience to know? So maybe describe the furniture if that's important. For instance, there's a difference between being in a bedroom and being in a kitchen. You're going to have different things, and people are going to be able to do different things depending on that location. So describing the furniture is helpful. Also, maybe who else is in the room, any relevant things that the person may be interacting with. For instance, they grab an apple and then a knife, who knows? And very importantly, what matters to the plot? For instance, if you were telling a mystery story or a crime story, and within this scene that you describe, you mentioned that there was a knife sitting there, and it turns out later that that knife was used in a murder, that's important. It's up to you whether you want to show it at that point or not, but having it present is an important thing. There's some broader things that you might want to consider with scene building as well. For instance, house rules. Let's say that the character wasn't allowed to have more than 2 people in their room at a given time, and they have 5 friends over. What kind of conflict is going to happen there, and how are they going to deal with that? Furthermore, let's say the difference between there's the socially acceptable things that happen outside of your home, but what about the things that happen inside with your family expectations? For instance, everyone could be walking around in short shorts and crop tops, but if your family isn't comfortable with you doing that, that's going to affect that character. All of these things help you to build a scene that people will be able to understand where the story sits and better relate to the story. For example, let's consider that you are telling a story about a family who owns a farm and they are struggling to make ends meet and keep the farm in business. So some of the things within world building and within scene setting that you may want to be aware of and share with people is perhaps the economy, agriculture. Social norms is also going to be important. How do people see farmers? Some things that you probably won't want to focus on unless you decide to take your story that way, but you probably don't want to worry about the crime rate within that town. You probably don't particularly care about the military in that world, or, you know, what are they doing for the space race in that world? And hey, they don't have any kids, so why would you focus on the education system in that world? It's not relevant to your story, so why would you include it? There is a lot to unpack with world building and scene setting, and there's a lot of resources online. All you really have to do is just Google world building tips, and you'll be able to come up with a bunch of lists of questions that can help you build a very fleshed out world. And it's up to you how much you want to develop it and share it yourself. If there is any particular aspect about world building that you want me to go over, by all means, put it into the comments, let me know, and maybe we can make it its own video later on. But for now, we're going to end this out, and that means that it's time for our story prompt. And today's story prompt is, tell a story about the time someone or something needed help. That's all for this video, so I hope that this has been helpful and informative. Again, I would love to see your stories no matter what format it comes in. Feel free to share on any of our social medias with Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. We're on everything. please let us know how things go. The library is open and I am there most days. So please come in and tell me all about your stories. I would love to hear them or see them or experience them. All right. Everyone have a great day. See you later. Bye.